Paul Berman, an intellectual, wrote a book some years ago, and he said, following September 11th, that there were two basic responses in much of the West to these events. One response was to say that there really wasn't any crisis, that there really wasn't any problem, that it was merely imaginary. And the second was to say that there was indeed a crisis, but it's our fault. When he said the word our and our fault, he was referring to the West in general, but of course, our fault is often interpreted as meaning Israel or the Jews. And so what I want to do briefly tonight is to talk about the broader situation in the Middle East, to follow up on the ambassador's fine remarks with some more details, and to explain why it's important for us, the West, Israel, and so on. And in fact, it's a broader challenge to Western civilization and democracy. So let me begin with the prehistory here. The central question, the first central question in the middle, well, I should say before this, so there is a crisis. It's not our fault. It's a crisis of the region. It's a crisis of that society. Thank you. Just as one wouldn't have said that the Napoleonic Wars or World War II or the Cold War were a crisis caused by external factors. These are internal factors, and they're part of the historic process. The first issue is this. In the West, the question of identity is basically resolved. In the Middle East, it is not resolved. In the West, people have concluded that no one ideology is going to take over everywhere, although there might be some people in Brussels who haven't heard that yet. And no one believes that one country in Europe can conquer the rest and rule the entire continent. Now, in history, of course, there were people and countries and dictators and ideas that thought they could succeed. This has not yet happened in the Middle East. The question of identity is not established. And in fact, there are three alternative identities. I mean the main identity, the main political identity, because everybody, or many people, have different identities. Is the main identity a national identity, meaning Arab, Turk, Persian, so on? Is the main identity a religious identity, particularly Muslim? Or is the identity of a citizen of a specific country to which loyalty is owed within the context of a democratic system? There are three movements that have three different answers to that question. There are the nationalists, and in the Arab world, Arab nationalists. There are the Islamists, and there are the moderate liberal Democrats. The problem is that the Islamists and the nationalists are like two elephants, and the Democrats are like a small mouse in terms of size. Now, we do know that in the age of the dinosaurs, those little mammals grew up and took over the world, but it took something like 60 million years. So we hope it won't take that long this time. But we are seeing a titanic struggle, and Israel has relatively little to do directly. Israel is affected by it. But this is a struggle among people in the region between the nationalists, who have dominated the Arab world for 60 years, the Islamists, who are the rising force, and the moderate liberal Democrats. One of the problems is that people in the West, because of the West's history, and increasingly East Asia has passed through this, believe that democracy and moderation and equality for women and tolerance and all of these things are natural and will inevitably triumph. Well, maybe they are, but how long will they take to triumph? And in the current period, they probably will not triumph. So the first question is, what identity? The second question is, why are we behind? Why is it that not only has the West surpassed the Muslim majority world in the Middle East, but so has East Asia, and in many respects, South America has also done so? What are the people doing wrong, and what is the solution? So there are three answers. The Arab nationalist answer is that that the people should continue to hit their heads against a stone wall. The moderate democratic answer is stop hitting your heads against a stone wall. Learn what is the basis of the success of the West and now the success of East Asia, even China in many respects, and other places, and stop hitting your head against a stone wall. And the revolutionary Islamist answer is we have to hit our heads against the stone wall much harder than we've done before. And if we do, the stone wall will crack and not our heads. That's funny, but the tragedy may be that this may be the idea that's going to dominate the Middle East over the next 20, 30, 40, or 50 years. Now, let's turn to the recent history of the region. Before the Arab Spring, there were three major developments. The first of those was, I'll say four major developments. The first of those was the Iranian Revolution. We might think the Iranian Revolution as parallel to the Bolshevik Revolution in the West, that it seemed to say that a certain ideology and system worked and could be copied. And so Iran became a radical Islamist state whose goal was to gain imperial control over the entire Middle East, and at times, some of the people think over the entire world. The second event, which was much quieter, was what happened in Turkey. Turkey had been a secular republic with various safeguards. The Turks had done very well. They had developed quickly. They had not been involved in any wars. With whatever its shortcomings, it was a success. But with the coming to power of the AK Party, you got people who were Islamists. They pretended to be a center-right party. They pretended to be moderate. But in fact, they were simply Islamists following a more clever strategy. And they succeeded very well. And they have dominated Turkey. I mean, if you include the latest election, they'll certainly dominate Turkey for at least 10 years and perhaps much longer. The government systematically worked to take over or destroy every institution in the country. There are more journalists in jail in Turkey today than in any other country in the world. When I criticized the government in a column I had in the Turkish newspaper, the column was canceled within 1 hour. Not because they supported the regime, because they were frightened of the regime. A friend of mine recalls how they have someone to come and help out with their children. He said, well, she's not the least bit religious, but she can't walk through her neighborhood without wearing a turban and covering up, because otherwise she'd be physically attacked. And this is in Istanbul, a city which prides itself on being a very Western and historically secular city. Finally, the Turkish regime in the last month or so has broken the armed forces, the last institution that stood in its way. And we've seen the acceleration of the radicalism of the regime. We've known about this for years. In fact, if you go to WikiLeaks, you can see a conversation that the Israeli ambassador to Turkey had with an American diplomat about 5 years ago. And he said, of course we know that these people are Islamists and they hate us. It's not due to the flotilla. It's not due to the operation in Gaza. It's due to the ideology of this regime, which has become more and more outspoken and hostile, and which supports Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and now trying to get along with the Muslim Brotherhood. So that means that the point when the Arab Spring began, the two main non-Muslim majority countries in the region, Turkey and Iran had already become revolutionary Islamist regimes. And that was the framework where this began. Now, people may wonder, where does the term Arab Spring come from? And the term Arab Spring comes from the Beirut Spring. The Beirut Spring refers to the massive demonstrations in Beirut against Syrian control of the country after the assassination of one of the leader, basically, of the Sunni Muslims and the most important political leader in the country by the Syrians. It's estimated that as many as 1 million people demonstrated in Beirut. Well, Lebanon has a population of about 3.5 million people. So you can see how impressive that is. In comparison, at the height of the demonstrations in Tahrir, the number of people who demonstrated in Cairo was 100,000 in a country whose population is 80 million. So therefore, the Beirut Spring had much more visible support, pro-democratic, pro-Western, anti-Islamist support than did what happened in Egypt. And where are we now today, what, 6, 7 years later, is that Lebanon is governed by a government which is dominated by Hezbollah, an Islamist regime, and the Syrians and the Iranians are back. So people don't realize when they use the phrase Arab Spring, they're referring to a previous event which began with much more of a base of support, with a much higher number of moderates than we've seen in Egypt, for example, and yet has ended with a repressive Islamist regime. So when you hear people use that phrase, think about what it really means. Another phrase that's used is the Turkish model. And you even hear Western leaders who say, oh, well, we hope that the Arab world follows the Turkish model. But what's the Turkish model? The Turkish model are people who are concealed radical Islamists running in elections, winning the elections, concealing their true views, and step by step transforming the society, taking it over, and trying to do so in a way that they will never be forced to lose power again through elections. So is the Turkish model a positive model that people in the West should cheer? Well, just like the phrase Arab Spring, the answer is no. It tells us the exact opposite of what people think. Last October, I read a speech by the leader of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, and I was really shocked by this speech. I wrote October 7th of last year, which is almost 1 year ago exactly today, this is an important new development. He is saying now is the time to go for revolution and jihad. He said the Egyptian government is weak, the West is weak, the United States is weak, and so now is the time to push for revolution. And the title of the article was, the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood has declared jihad on the West. Will anyone in the West notice? And some of my friends who read the article wrote me and said, no, they didn't notice. In January, we know that the Tahrir demonstrations, which did express discontent with the dictatorship and did express hope for democracy on the part of many people, was organized by the April 6th Youth Movement. The April 6th Youth Movement is a left-wing group in alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Muslim Brotherhood people told them, we are going to stay out of it because we know that the government is going to blame us. And sure enough, when the demonstration started with no Muslim Brotherhood participation, the first thing the Mubarak government did was to arrest several dozen Muslim Brotherhood leaders. But when they saw that it was succeeding and the army was not crushing it, the Muslim Brotherhood came out into the streets. Now consider this. The biggest demonstration organized by the April 6th Youth Movement, by the Tahrir Square people, was 100,000 people. After the fall of Mubarak, the Muslim Brotherhood organized a demonstration in Cairo with more than 1 million people. And if you and it was heavily Brotherhood, it was heavily Islamist. In fact, one of the leaders of the Tahrir Square demonstrations tried to get up on the stage and make a speech, and they threw him off. We don't know. And it's saying, in effect, we don't need you anymore. So all of this was quite clear. And the problem is, there are several problems. First of all, it's much easier to promote revolutionary Islamism or nationalism, which are very simple ideologies, appealing to passions and personal experience, than liberal democracy, which is a more complex idea, much of which is imported. The Islamists have the money. The Islamists have organized networks. The Democrats don't. The Islamists are willing to kill people and to use violence. The Democrats aren't. And so when you put all of these and other factors together, the moderates are at a deep disadvantage. We are now moving toward elections. On October the 23rd, there will be elections in Tunisia for a popular assembly to draw up a constitution, and so on and so forth. Now, Tunisia, I think the ambassador made this point, is the most secularized society in the Arab world. In fact, if you're interested, you can go to the I Edit Maria Journal. We had a wonderful article by a Tunisian on how Islam was taught in Tunisia, including one of the final exam that was given. And this is like closer to the way religion is taught in the West. They teach comparative religion, they're open and tolerant, so on. So if any country should make it, it should be Tunisia. But we see the polls are indicating that something like 20% of the voters will support Islamist groups in Tunisia. Now you can say 20%, that doesn't sound so bad. But the problem is that the other 80% is divided among 20 or 30 parties. So therefore, if in Tunisia, the most moderate, secular-oriented country in the world, where, for example, in legal terms, women's status is higher than any other Arab country, if Islamists can become the largest group in Tunisia, what does this tell us? There was a debate a few years back between Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, and Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the most senior cleric in the Muslim Brotherhood. Bin Laden said, we should not participate in elections because the legislation for human beings is set by Allah. People cannot change it. Elections are rotten and illegitimate. We will boycott elections. And Qaradawi, and when I explain this to people in the Czech Republic, they understand all this, think of Qaradawi as Lenin. Qaradawi said, what, are you crazy? Of course we'll participate in elections because we'll win them. Now that doesn't make somebody a moderate. That makes somebody a good tactician. And that is the philosophy of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I predict, based on polls, and we don't know, as the ambassador pointed out what will happen, but I predict that the Muslim Brotherhood will get 30 to 40% of the seats. They will be the largest single party. They will not take over the country or run the country. But when you consider that other seats will be held by far-left groups, which on foreign policy agree with the Muslim Brotherhood, and people willing to make deals, that they will be able to play the most significant role in writing the new constitution. And the army now says, the army's gotten nervous, and they say, well, we want to stay in power until around June 2013, after the new constitution is written, and at that time we'll elect a president. So as long as the army is in power, they will keep a certain limit on things, but when they leave power, we can predict that this is going to be a radical regime. I'll come back to Egypt in a second, but first I want to say, the fact that Iran, more recently Turkey, and now Egypt, and Lebanon, and the Gaza Strip have all gone to come under the power of revolutionary Islamist groups some of which openly talk about committing genocide against the Jewish people, that openly talk of their hatred of the West, that openly organize or support terrorism. This is terrible shock. This is a disaster for Western and European interests. And yet, if you look in the media, and by the way, I mean, I think everything I've said to you so far is easily demonstrable. It's quite factual. Nothing I've said so far should be the least bit controversial. But try to stand up and say it in a university in the Netherlands or elsewhere. Try to get it into the media in the Netherlands or elsewhere, and people are shocked because it's this denial, but it's a very dangerous denial. Let me say a little more about Egypt here. That one problem in Egypt is the Christian minority, the Copts, who are approximately 10% of the population. That means we're talking about the population of the Netherlands is 14 million people, is that right? 16, sorry. All right, so we're talking about more than 8 million people. We're talking about population, half that of the entire, this entire country. And what can these people look to for what's happening? A few days ago, a church was burned down, and when there was a demonstration to protest it, at least 25 Christians were killed, many of them by the army. No one will be arrested, no one will be punished. One church after another is being torched. Half the Christians, we estimate, half the Christians in Iraq have left, and the survival of the rest is tenuous. The entire population of Christians of the Gaza Strip is left. These are huge events of the greatest importance. Where is the Western response? Where is the Western understanding? So this is the environment that we're facing in the region. And it's within this context that people say the biggest problem in the Middle East is the Israel-Palestinian problem. The biggest problem is the precise siting of border between Israel and Palestine. The biggest problem is Israel. Again, let me review briefly. You have a very large country called Iran, which supports terrorism, which represses its people, which is probably about to execute a man because he converted to Christianity and became a minister. That I believe it did execute a woman recently because she defended herself from being raped and killed the attacker. I mean, that's big. We have Gaza Strip, we have Turkey, we have Egypt. These are huge countries, many times the population of Israel, with governments extremely hostile to the West. But, of course, it's safer to bash Israel because Israel isn't going to do anything about it to people in Europe. And it goes further. I edited a book. We went to people in 55 countries and said, please write about Islamist movements in your countries from an academic standpoint. Only one person, I'm obviously not going to say the name, one person refused my invitation, who was the contributor from the Netherlands, who said that he would fear for his life if he wrote that chapter. And I said to him, look, we're not asking you to criticize anybody at all. We just want an academic thing, names of the groups, and their size, and their viewpoint, and their leaders, and their goals. He said, these people don't take that stuff into consideration. So this is the seriousness of the challenge that we face. Now, many people respond to a challenge like that by wanting to hide and deny the truth and pretend it isn't happening. But I don't need to tell you that if that's the response you take, things are only going to get worse, and you're going to be in a much more serious situation than you were otherwise. I don't want to talk at great length about Israel or Israel-Palestinian issues, but there's one specific point I want to make because it's hardly ever made, and I call this the day after issues. We get in the West the assumption that if a Palestinian state were to be created, or even if Israel and the Palestinian state were to sign an agreement, it would be the end of history. Everyone would live happily ever after, and there would be no problems thereafter. And I mean, I'm saying it in a mocking way in a sense, but it's true. This is what people say. But what are some of the issues that Israel has to consider? What happens if within a few weeks and considerable incitement on the part of that Palestinian state, radio, the television, the newspaper, the schools, cross-border attacks against Israel begin? And they say, we can't stop them, we can't find the people who are doing it, we're really sorry, but you know, they're just doing this and we have no idea who it is. When of course they know who the people are. How can Israel defend itself? If Israel retaliates, Palestine will go to the UN and file under Article 51 that Israel is an aggressor and ask the General Assembly for sanctions against Israel. And it's something that could happen. And therefore, if that were to happen, it's almost certain that Israel would face a much worse and extremely dangerous strategic situation. Second, what would stop that state from, especially if it's declared at the UN unilaterally, from importing weapons, including anti-aircraft missiles, from other countries, asking advisors from Syria or Iran or Egypt or anywhere else? What basis would Israel have to block it? Who would support Israel in blocking it? And thirdly of all, what would happen when that government, as is inevitable, is replaced by another government, either by elections, or by the way, remember the Palestinian Authority government is not elected now. They just canceled the elections because they knew they wouldn't, they feared they wouldn't win them. So what happens when a new government comes to power? Or what happens if Hamas or a Hamas radical Fatah coalition take over and say, well, we didn't sign this agreement, we're not responsible for it, so therefore we're tearing it up. This is what we're seeing happen in Egypt. Now that's an example of the kind of thing that you'll never hear on television or radio or media or the classroom. And yet it's the most obvious fact. And if people can respond to what I say, then let them respond. But I sure know that I can respond effectively to what they say. And the reason they have to censor us out and intimidate people is precisely because their arguments are so weak. What should be done about this very difficult and dangerous situation? And there is a very specific policy response that's available. And it's this, that those who oppose revolutionary Islamism and repression and the stoning of women and the execution of people because they want to change their religion and all of those things work together in whatever way is possible. That is, and it should happen under U.S. leadership, and that raises other problems because of the state of U.S. policy right now. But the North America and Europe and Israel and those Arab states that do not want to be taken over by revolutionary Islamism, and I can provide you a list if you like, and the democratic oppositions in places like Turkey and Lebanon and Iran, but real moderate Democrats, not people who are just pretending to be for a few minutes, need to work together. This is the formula that was necessary against fascism in the 1930s and 40s. It was the formula necessary against communism during the Cold War. It's the same basic formula that's necessary today. Is this somehow some kind of horrible colonial, imperialist, racist, Islamophobic enterprise? No, not at all. Because the most immediate and main victims of this dictatorship, of these revolutions, are Muslims. In every country where it has, where it's taken over, or whether it's sponsoring terrorism throughout the Middle East and into Asia as well. These people are the victim, and many of them, hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions of these people do not want to live under revolutionary Islamist dictatorships. So talk to those people. And to pretend that you're pro-Palestinian because you support a regime and a movement and a leadership that wants to fight on for 50 or 80 years and sacrifice thousands of lives rather than be flexible and negotiate a two-state solution now, that's not being pro-Palestinian. Supporting dictatorships that are very repressive and murderous is not being pro-Muslim or pro-Arab, any more than supporting Stalinism would make you pro-Russian people, or supporting Nazism would make you pro-the German people. We have to challenge and break these illusions and lies. Now, this is an extremely difficult task, but it's a task that we have no choice but to engage in. And we do have some things on our side. One thing is our enemies, because they will push too hard. They will demand too much. They will turn to violence and repression and hate too quickly, to the point where it is impossible to conceal. And if people put their heads under the ground like ostriches supposedly do, then they will tunnel under that ground and put right in their face the nature of those regimes and movements and ideologies. And another thing we have in our favor is that most important of all allies, reality. Because it will become increasingly visible that this system does not work, its true nature cannot be concealed. Remember that when George Orwell created the perfect dictatorship in 1984, there were 3 slogans: war is peace, freedom is slavery, and, I'm faltering here, any Orwell fans in the audience? Thank you, and truth is lies. Well, that sounds pretty much like what we're dealing with today. So that's the situation. It's difficult. We must start by facing it. Now, people then hear what I've said, and I usually don't put in some of the more positive things I did at the end, and they say to me, well, you're a very pessimistic person. And I say, no, not at all. I'm not pessimistic for a number of reasons. We've been through this twice before, as I pointed out earlier, in living memory. And in the end, West, democracy, freedom won against fascism, against Nazism. But in addition to that, I am a great believer in Israel. As you know, we've just ended the Jewish year, and every year there's a major poll conducted which is released on the New Year's Day. This year the poll was as follows: do you believe that Israel, among Israelis, do you believe Israel is a good place to live? 88% said yes. Do you believe that there will be peace soon? 65% said no. So this is people deal with that, will deal with the difficulty of the task, and are willing to face the task and know that to survive we must be realistic. And the ambassador made some of these references to give a more, that's all water under the bridge. To give a more specific example, the figures show that the Israeli economy grew in 2010 at the rate of almost 3 times faster than that of the other developed countries, and it was #1 among all the, quote, Hong Kong and Singapore were ahead, but you know, these are very small places. So Israel is sort of the #1 in terms of kind of regular countries. Israel can defend itself, and Israel will be able to defend itself, but we would certainly like to have your support, as the Dutch people in the past have been so favorable and supportive of Israel and of the Jewish people, and we hope that that can be renewed. I will stop there. I know, by the way, I haven't addressed Syria, and I haven't addressed some other things, but I'll leave those for your questions. Thank you for your patience.